I'm also going to talk a little bit about our economic landscape that we're now living in. We have a new global economy compared to what we had last century, and I think it's important to understand how this works. This is the developed world: Europe, United States and Canada, Israel, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. A couple other places I'm missing, but that's essentially it. Um, and the developed world is in blue, the developing world is in gray. And for a long time, the developed world has been the top dog when it comes to global commerce. What we're finding these days, of course, is that the developing world is rising, and they're rising quite quickly. And this has pretty big implications for work in the developed world. One of the things we're discovering is that we're seeing the disappearance in much of the developed world of non-location dependent manual work. In other words, the kind of work that we do with our bodies. Some of that is location dependent. The person who drives the cab in downtown Auckland, the person who administers the MRI machine on you in the middle of the night when you think you have appendicitis, the person who comes and fixes your hot water heater or replaces the shingles on your roof, the person who waits on you at the restaurant. All of those people have to be right here to do that work. Right? You can't offshore, outsource your haircut to another country, for example. But there's lots of other manual work that's non-location dependent that can literally be done anywhere in the world. Your classic factory job is an example of this. So we know that factory jobs are location independent because we have communities that fight for them. So in the States, for example, we have a grand tradition of various American states fighting for factories. Build your factory here. We'll give you discounts. We'll help you build the infrastructure. We'll give you tax breaks for a decade, and so on. They're trying to pull those jobs to different locations. Many of those classic factory jobs of course, are now going to the developing world because the wages are much cheaper. So the typical American factory worker, for example, who used to get paid $35, $40 an hour, first they faced competition from places like Mexico, which maybe paid their workers $17 to $20 an hour, or places like Thailand, which were paying their folks $8 to $10 an hour. And now they're facing competition from places like India and China, where the factory work can be done for sometimes as low as $1 or $2 an hour. So the challenge with those jobs is that they don't require a lot of specialized skill or training or education. They literally can be done by anybody, any body, and the bodies are typically cheapest in the developing world. We're also seeing the disappearance from the developed world of routine cognitive work, where you do the same kind of mental work over and over again. People who take catalog orders, for example, are classic examples of this. They, you call them up, you order a few pairs of pants, a shirt, the fedora on page 16. They get your sizes and colors and credit card information. They hang up, you hang up. Somebody else calls them. They do the exact same mental process all over again. We have lots and lots of jobs in the economy that are essentially routine cognitive work. Basically, anybody that pushes paper around for a living, any kind of administrative assistant, secretary, receptionist kind of job is mostly routine cognitive work. Not all, but mostly. Anybody who does call support or customer support or technical support, a lot of legal research is fairly routine. Some parts of computer programming are relatively routine cognitive work. And so on. So we have huge segments of sort of the lower wage, typically white collar economy that are routine cognitive work. And of course, those jobs, unless they're also location dependent, can occur anywhere in the world because we invented this thing called the internet that allows us to move information across the planet at the speed of light. So even though the cab driver or bus driver in Auckland has to be right there. The person who keeps the books for the cab company or bus company could be anywhere in the world. Even though the person who administers the MRI in the middle of the night when you think you have appendicitis has to be right there at the hospital, the person who interprets the results doesn't have to be on call. They could be working during the daytime hours in another country somewhere, because we can send the scan anywhere on the planet. And so on. The person who argues the case before the judge has to be right there, but the person who did the legal research on the back end could be anywhere. So what we're finding is that we have lots and lots of decent, fairly good-paying white-collar jobs that are also vulnerable to offshoring because they can locate anywhere in the world, and we just communicate with those people via email and telephone and video conferencing and so on. And it's not just the lower wage white collar jobs that are being affected. We're also seeing jobs being replaced by software. So every time you fill out a form online, you replace somebody's data entry job. Every time you use a kiosk at a hotel or an airport, you've reduced the number of frontline service personnel that you need. Every time you use an ATM, that's one fewer bank tellers that we need. Every time you make your own reservations online for a car or a hotel or a flight, you've reduced the number of travel agents that we need. Every time you plug your own numbers into the website and hit the calculate button, you've reduced the number of routine cognitive mortgage application evaluators that we need, et cetera, et cetera. So that we're able, if your job can be turned into an algorithm, it requires any kind of routine mental processing, often we can create software that will do that work. And under this self-service economy idea, we'll do it ourselves because it's more convenient than it is to wait and pay somebody to do it. And people are losing their jobs left and right because the software is doing it instead, along with our willingness to plug in parts ourselves. It's happening at the upper end of the white-collar wage spectrum as well. Think about legal software or tax preparation software, where we're replacing accountants and CPAs and attorneys with software, and they're taking big chunks of those, big hits on those chunks of their incomes. So this location independence idea is pretty huge, and whether or not we can move your job somewhere else. So what's happening here then is that, so here's a graph from the United States, is that if your job is routine manual work and it's non-location dependent, if you are doing routine cognitive work, the yellow line on the screen, and again, it's non-location dependent, it's disappearing because we can situate it somewhere else and it can be done a lot cheaper. And for all the talk about protecting jobs and tariffs and so on, the bottom line is that these multinational companies just cannot afford to employ people at a rate of 5-10 times what their competitors are paying. And nor can their subcontractors or their subcontractors or their subcontractors or their parts makers or whatever, or the other goods providers that are further down the chain of production. I mean, bottom line is the work's going to go to where the skill and talent is or where the lowest wage is. So where's the growth in the developed world? The growth in jobs is in non-routine, more abstract cognitive work, sort of the green line on the screen as you see it now. It's the people who do this kind of stuff, right? They're critical thinkers, they're problem solvers, they're information literate, they're entrepreneurial, they're innovative and adaptable, they're savvy when it comes to global issues, they're effective speakers and communicators and writers. They have the ability to take large amounts of information and synthesize them and analyze them. They can use technology effectively to collaborate with people all over the globe. They're media fluent and so on. These are those skills that can't be replaced by software, and they can't be replaced by some relatively unskilled manual labor somewhere else. This is the kind of work that people still need done, and it's worth paying for. These are the jobs that justify the developed world's wage premium and standard of living. So here's some data from New Zealand. I showed you a little bit of data from the US. Here's from your own Department of Labor. You can see in the left-hand column that this is historical data through 2008. And you can see that, if you're in a highly skilled occupation, or skilled associate, that you saw nice steady growth in the number of jobs available to those people. But if you were relatively unskilled, or relatively uneducated, that you saw very flat growth in terms of the number of jobs available to you. But the column I want to focus on is the column on the right. It's the future growth projections, the future employment demand by skill categories. As we project out into the future, and it's hard to do that too far out, but let's say out through the next 7 years or so, out through 2018, what does that kind of growth look like? And even with the recession, we can see that fairly nice steady growth for people with skills and higher levels of education, and flat to non-existent growth for people in the lower end of the skill spectrum. If you take those yearly averages over on the right and you plot those out into a graph, it looks like this. Now, obviously, it's not going to be as smooth as this. There's going to be ups and downs. These are averages. But if you just take the averages and chart them out, this is what it looks like. So you can see over time the divergence between those people with high skills and those people with relatively low skills and low education. It's those people up in the upper end of the graph that are more likely to possess those non-routine cognitive skills that are going to allow them to flourish in a hyper-competitive global economy. Those are where the growth is in terms of jobs in New Zealand. So you'll notice that graph looks a lot like that one from America that I showed you before. Nice steady growth in non-routine abstract cognitive skills, jobs that require those, not much growth or declining growth in all the rest of it. So we used to have this paradigm where we had 3 categories of jobs. We had the low-skilled jobs, and they paid relatively low wages, minimum wage or just barely above that. So maybe you couldn't even get out of secondary, or you barely got out of secondary, but you could go down the local construction site and you could swing a hammer, and you could help build a house. You could tote lumber on your shoulder. You could drive nails. So we had those kind of jobs. On the other end of the spectrum, we had the highly skilled professionals, and they got a relatively high wage. These were sort of your classic middle class and upper middle class jobs, really sort of the backbone of the economy in many ways. And then we had this middle category, which was the category that built much of the developed world over the last century, which is where we took people that had relatively low skills, but we paid them high wages. So the classic factory job in America is an example of this, where we took somebody that maybe didn't even graduate from high school, but they could go down the street to the local factory and they could make 25, 35, 40 bucks an hour and earn a living, right? They could raise a family. They could afford some of the niceties of middle-class life, like a television and a car and a vacation now and then. They could, they had pensions that took care of retirement, et cetera. And what we're finding in much of the developed world is that middle category is disappearing because it's very hard in a hyper-competitive global economy to pay people high wages when they only have low skills, because we can find somebody else to do that same low-skill work much cheaper. So what we're seeing is the divergence of the job market, so that you either have high skills, you're highly educated, you have lots of good training that allows you to do more of that non-routine abstract work that's worth paying for. And that's true whether you're a business professional or an artisan or craftsman or factory worker on the line. We still need you, if we're going to pay you a developed world's wage that will pay for your standard of living, you're going to have more than just basic skills. Or you're going to fall in the basic skills, low education category, and you're going to be making minimum wage or just barely above it, and just barely you can buy. Now, we do have a middle category in New Zealand that's a little bit different. What the labor economists here tell me is that we have folks that are relatively low skill, but they're earning medium wage because you have such a strong tourism industry, is that these are not the people who are the baristas at the coffee shop, or the people who work at the restaurants, or your guides at the local tourism activity, but the people who own those spaces. So the person who owns the coffee shop, or who owns the small business that runs the tourism activity. Those people are relatively low skill in many cases, but they're making a medium kind of wage, which is kind of keeping some of the New Zealand economy afloat. But bottom line is that these lower wage jobs and these medium wage jobs aren't going to drive your economy forward. So there was a op-ed in the press recently here in Christchurch that talked about how the New Zealand economy is essentially going to have to double over the next 10 or 15 years in order to continue paying for all of the strong social supports that you guys have and to keep the economy flowing along. You're not going to double your economy with lower medium wage workers, particularly since you have sort of a ceiling on how many of those people you need, right? You're only going to get so many tourists. You're only going to have so many people living in New Zealand. In other words, there's only so many plumbers that you need. There's only so many coffee shop workers that you need before you tap out. And where the growth and the innovation, the creation of new jobs and new businesses and new growth is up on the right side of the spectrum, where people can be creative and innovative, think outside of the box, and create new opportunities that are valued in the global economy. So essentially, you have to ask yourself, can somebody overseas do my job cheaper, or can a computer do it faster? If you say yes to either of your questions, your job is gone. So this is Shanghai, China. It's We've got more skyscrapers than any other city in the world, and of course a lot of smog. China is rapidly becoming the factory to the planet. This is the YPro campus on Bangalore, India, and India is rapidly becoming the back office to the planet. What we have going on here is that as China and India reascend into the geopolitical sphere of things, is that together they bring about 2.5 billion people. And so even if we ignored the rest of the developing world, if we ignored the rest of Asia, Africa, Latin America, and so on, if we only paid attention to India and China, 2.5 billion people. Now, they've moved more people out of poverty over the last few decades than at any other point in human history. What they've done is just absolutely staggering, but they still have a long way to go. So even though, let's say 80% of their population is still stuck in $2 a day poverty or less, that other 20%, that other 500 million people is equivalent to the entire labor force of America and Europe combined, which means that we're almost doubling the number of global workers that are out there. And of course, the second half of those that are entering the market from the developing world are a lot cheaper than the first half from the developed world. So, you used to be able to rely on geographic monopolies. You were the only person within 50 kilometers that sold books, so you had a guaranteed market. You were the only accountant within 30 kilometers, so you had guaranteed business. You're the only person within 20 kilometers that had a particular idea that was worth resonating around and building a following. And now you can't rely on that geographic monopoly anymore because of the web. No matter how rurally isolated you are, you're in economic competition with everybody else on the planet for what you do. Because, as long as shipping costs remain relatively low and the convenience factor relatively high, it's much easier often to just order books and wait a couple of days from somebody else than to pay the price premium for your small business in your little local area or to pay for your services. And so the question we have is that, the challenge that we have in the developed world is that, without bashing India or China, we have to recognize that they can flood markets with lots of workers who can do what we've done in the past. And they're able to do that work that we've been able to do. We can find them easily over the web, but they work a lot cheaper. So we're entering an era now where if this is the work you do, right, if the work you do is sort of a commodity cheeseburger kind of work, the kind of work that anybody can make, right, anybody can make this cheeseburger. And this cheeseburger is worth paying maybe $1 or $2 for at most. But anybody can make that cheeseburger. If this is what you're offering in the developed world, you're going to get out-hustled and outpriced by somebody else. This is the kind of cheeseburger that's worth paying $5, $6, $8, $10 for, right? This is worth paying extra for because this is a cheeseburger that few people can make. Anybody can make this cheeseburger. Few people can make this cheeseburger. So if you apply this concept to your job, you can see that in the developed world, you better be a fancy cheeseburger, because if all you're offering is this, the developing world, for example, or somebody somewhere else can create that cheeseburger for a lot less than what you want to get paid for it. So if you want to justify getting paid your premium cost, then you better be able to offer much greater value. And that value right now in an information and knowledge economy is around non-routine, abstract cognitive skills. So essentially what's going on here is that we're asking employees to live up on the upper end of Bloom's more often to do that non-routine cognitive work as part of their day-to-day jobs. That's where the growth is in the developed world. So, here's a pyramid from the new Commission for Skills of the American Workforce, and this could just as easily apply to New Zealand or any other developed country, where they said that if all goes well, the bulk of the work that's done in the US or another developed country will be creative work, that non-routine, abstract stuff, because any kind of routine work, whether it's physical work or mental work, that's done by people or machines, will occur in less developed countries or will be replaced by software. So that's the global economic landscape that we now live in as part of the developed world. The challenge for us is how do we rise to the demands of the new hyper-competitive global economy and essentially have more of our workers be gourmet cheeseburgers, because those are the skills and talents that justify the wage premium and standard of living premium that we've enjoyed to date.